technical work. I'm Pat Finnerty. I'm with the Urbandale Historical Society. I came across this book, James Jorden, Pursuit of a Dream, James Jorden, His Life and His Legacy, some years ago. It's written by Louise Gately in conjunction with Jan Davison. But Louise was the real instigator behind it all. And I found it fascinating, particularly when I think about the Olmsted family and their impact here in Urbandale. Well, James Jorden had that same impact, if you will, in West Des Moines or Valley Junction, I guess whatever you want to call it. But then he kind of predated, I think, our Olmsteds a bit. I'm sure they knew each other.
When did Olmsted come here?
They would have been in the early 1900s.
Okay, yeah.
1870s is when Leander
Right, yeah.
and Charlotte.
Yeah, so I'm sure they
Okay.
would have known each other. And,
Absolutely.
yeah, and but anyway, I found the book quite fascinating, and so we've asked Louise to come. She's involved with the West Des Moines Historical Society, so she's a colleague, if you will, just to the south of us. So Louise, I'm not going to say any more. I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Pat, I thought your name was Ed for the longest
Yeah.
time.
Well, Edward Patrick.
Okay, well there you go, because it was the email address
Yes.
that made me think it was
Oh.
Ed. And I kept sending my emails to Ed. So you probably thought, well, what's going on here? Get her name right. Get my name right. Okay, so I will introduce myself, and I told Pat that he didn't need to worry about it. So one of the things people ask about when why did I write this book? And I wrote it, but my editor, who's on the back here, she was so instrumental in making sure that it was a good book. That I just felt like, and we were such a good team, and we didn't know each other very well in the beginning, and now we are closest of friends, as you can well imagine. So what made me write this book? People say, "Why did you write this book?" Whenever there's questions and answers, and they say, "Well, what do you think?" And they say, "You must be a Jorden." And I say, "No, I'm not a Jorden." And then and I explained that I was born and raised in Wisconsin, and outside of Milwaukee, and the reason I'm even here in Iowa is I went to Drake, and that's what brought me here. But I do have relatives that we called it a century farm. I don't even know if you can do that anymore, and they came about the same time as the Olmsteds in the 1870s, and they were out in Colfax, over by the Skunk River. One of the borders of, or property lines of their farm is the Skunk River. So they came to Colfax then, and so I used to visit, and my grandmother was born in Boone in 1900. So, yeah, 3 years before Mamie. Anyways, and so that was a reason for us to always visit Iowa. There was no more Boone, but certainly Colfax every year, every summer we would come to Colfax. So I just had a nice feeling about Iowa, and was happy to choose to go to Drake University. They say, people that wonder why I wrote the book, they say, well, you must be really into Iowa history, and absolutely not. When I was at Drake, I majored in Renaissance and Reformation. Had nothing to do with U.S. history, Iowa history. I knew nothing about Iowa history, nothing, nothing. But anyways, one of the things that that I really took with me from my bachelor's degree through even today, like right now I'm reading a book about religions in the Middle Ages, which would put most people to sleep, and it does put me to sleep sometimes too. But I've always been very interested in how religion impacts history. And in this book, if you decide you want to read it, or if you do read it, you'll understand how much religion, and James Jorden was a very religious man, devout Methodist in the end. Family started out as Presbyterians when they first came to the United States. Anyways, that just was a huge, huge influence in his life. And And the Methodist religion was a very big influence in the life of Iowans and as Iowa developed. And that there's a thread of religion throughout this book. So I suppose that is one of the reasons why I was, really into writing this, because that was a really big part of it. I mean, it's not like all of it, but there's that, if you're at all interested in that. And if you're Methodist especially, or Protestant, you'll understand about those beginning pioneers who came in the 1840s and 50s and settled. He was one of, if you have family roots that go back that far, here in the Des Moines area, you probably have the same story that is told in this book. Your family does. It's very typical, very typical. Then they say, did you, what got you started on this? Why did you do this? And so then I go into the story. So I graduated from Drake with a history major, and I wasn't going to be a teacher, but I did pick up a teaching certificate so that I was employable. Because as my parents said and were saying to our grandchildren, what are you going to do with a history degree? And we have one now graduating in art history, and we're saying, and how are you going to, what kind of a job are you going to do, after you get out? And I thought, I better probably pick up a teaching certificate in secondary. And then my husband and I was married while I was in college. He was in the Air Force, and this was in the early 70s. We were stationed overseas in Germany, and then came back. He's a lawyer. He was a lawyer. We're divorced, but came back and went back to work for a law firm that he was working in just prior to going to the military. So that brought me back to Des Moines, and I settled in, lived on the west side of Des Moines. But while I was in college, I worked for Baker's Cafeteria, and I'm not Bishop's, Baker's. Remember Baker's over in Sherwood Forest? Of course. How could we not know Russell Baker and Vicki Baker, right? And they were longtime residents of West Des Moines, and Vicki was completely and totally dedicated to the Jorden House and the West Des Moines Historical Society for many, many years. And now she's president of, I think, at least the United States Questers, or, really high ranking. If you're a Quester, she's where it's at in the hierarchy. But at any rate, the West Des Moines Historical Society had kind of formed in 1977, maybe a little earlier, under a different person who passed. And Vicki ended up taking it over in the late 70s, early 80s. And that was about the same time that my husband at the time, and I came back to Des Moines. And we, of course, reunited our friendship with the Bakers. And Vicki said, what are you doing? And I said, well, I was working in Europe, but right now I'm not doing anything. Well, you know how that is. Hey, I have something you could be doing. And so what she did was she got me involved in the early 80s at the Jorden House. Now, the Jorden House at the time was a mess. And you know that because you've probably put this house together. I think this house might have been less of a mess than the Jorden House. It was horrible. It had been used by the Church of the Nazarenes as a dormitory for the campers. And, campers, kids are just not real respectful of anything. And it was a mess anyhow, so who cares, if there's another hole in the wall or whatever. The other thing is that it had never been really plumbed while the Jordans were in there. But they did some real primitive plumbing so that they could have bathrooms in that place. Well, in the wintertime, the pipes would freeze, and then, it's plaster and lath, and that would just be a mess, and ceilings were falling in, and all of this, and Vicki was so excited to take over that project. Well, she's one in a million, isn't she? So, what we all know that it takes money to put these places back together. And so she said, I'm busy writing hotel motel tax money grants, this grant, that grant, and I heard Bravo, all of the grants, that wasn't available at the time, but what money was available in the early 80s was grantors were trying to diversify. And one of the easy things to diversify to was projects of the Underground Railroad, because that included African Americans, and that was always, you know, a good thing to do. And people wanted to say that they had given money for this kind of a project. And so that is why you always hear Jorden House Underground Railroad, Jorden House Underground Railroad. And that's really the beginning money that we got was mainly focused around that. And we are now, you know, on the National Historical Register, and one of the homes noted and documented as being on the Underground Railroad. That was all done. So what had happened is I had been working in higher education. I ran college programs in Europe, and when I came back, I did have a hiatus of employment, but then went to work as the assistant registrar at Drake University. I had started my master's degree, but while I was in Europe, but then finished it at Drake. And my area was higher ed administration. Of course, I was working in that area. But also, my focus was on development, which is fundraising, PR and communications, all of that. That all goes under the development, you know, umbrella. So one of the things I learned to do when I was doing that program was how to write grants. Well, that was perfect, because that's what Vicki needed, is somebody to write grants. And so the two of us collaborated. I'm not going to say that I wrote all the grants. I did not. We both worked hard for years and years on getting them written. But when you write a grant, and you know this too, you have to know what, you know, the subject about what you're writing. And believe me, James Jorden was not a known situation, you know, entity at all. I mean, there were things about James Jorden in some of the old books, and this is one, a page from one of the books, which was, you know, a wealth of information. And then there were some others. There were some other books too that had mentioned him, and that was great because that really helped me know about his life. But there were things in his life that I really didn't understand. I didn't understand, you know, about what had really happened about the State Bank of Iowa. I didn't know that much about American history, so the Kansas-Nebraska bill, you know, the struggle to move the state capital from Iowa City. I'm from Wisconsin, here, you know, all that, and et cetera, et cetera. And so it was like, oh, well, I know some of these facts, that's great. And also I had gotten to know, Vicki had gotten something from not an ancestor, a descendant in the Jorden family who was really into family genealogy. And she did back in the 60s and probably early 70s what we now do on the computer, and that, you know, I can't even imagine how many letters she wrote and how much research that she did. But she put the Jorden genealogy together pretty well and found a lot of stories. Some of the stories is exactly word for word out of that. So, you know, somebody must have sent that to her. She was living in Idaho at the time. So she put together this book and sent it so wonderfully to the Jorden House, and so that was a wonderful source. Now you would think, and I don't know what was going on in the attic of Olmsted House. Maybe you had letters, maybe you had pictures, maybe you had memorabilia. I remember when I was at Drake and we were celebrating our centennial, and our registrar's annex was up in the top of Old Main, and in the back were boxes and boxes of photos and this and that had just been sitting there, being eaten or you know, just decomposing and whatever, but at least there was something. And so what we did was we took that, and I being a history major and also part of the registrar's office, I was asked by the administration to, you know, kind of curate that collection and pull things out and preserve and whatever, and now most of it is in the library. Well, wouldn't that have been nice if we would have had that at the Jorden House? I don't know if you had it at Olmsted House. We did not have it at all. And so what I had to do was I had to collect information, not only about James Jorden, you know, the little bit that there was, but then to try to put the story together, and it was quite a puzzle. And now, the major emphasis, of course, always was at that point on the Underground Railroad. because that's where we were getting our funding from, and of course, that's what you're gonna do. But, and so we learned a lot about it. One of the things that I did do is every time I would do some research about anything having to do with James Jorden or Valley Junction or, you know, West Des Moines history, is I would write it up. And I do enjoy writing, and so that was good. I did a lot of their PR and marketing stuff back in the day. I did a lot of pamphlets and brochures, explaining some of the history back in the day. And this was in the early 80s, early to mid 80s, and maybe going a little bit into the latter part of the 80s. Anything that I would write, I would give away. So there were a lot of people writing about the Underground Railroad. Let's just use that and then that's the best example. And they knew that the Jorden House was a stop on the Underground Railroad, but they didn't really know that much about it like we know today. The gal that was sitting at the desk at the Jorden House, Penny, she would say, they'd call up and they'd say, you know, what do you know about this? And then they'd say, call Louise. And then Louise would say, okay, I've got this piece here, you know, and what's your address? I'll just send it to you, send it off. And then, you know, a year later, I'd see the book, you know, that they'd written, and I'd see word for word, you know, anything that I'd done, which is fine, because I felt like that was my service to the community, you know, to spread the word about what happened at the Jorden House. I was more than happy to do that. But then what happened is I continued to write about different aspects of Jorden's life as I started to research and learn, and continuing to share them, and then lo and behold, somebody came through the Jorden House in the 90s, probably late 90s maybe. His name was Barry Hare, and he was from Downing Publishing, and he said to Penny at the office, you know, we do historical books. They're out of Omaha, and they do historical books all over the United States. And he said, this is my territory, that you're a historical society. Are you at all interested in, you know, or do you have anything, you know, or whatever, you know, publishing something? Do you have, you know, have you done any research about the Jorden House or James Jorden or whatever? And guess what Penny said? Call Louise. And so he did. And you know, it was hilarious because he said, I'm you know, interested in doing, you know, seeing if you're interested, if you've, you know, about your, he called it my book, because by then there was enough information that it was a small, you know, kind of a small compilation, and you could maybe, you know, really stretching it, call it a book. It wasn't a book. It was just a bunch of stuff that I'd researched that was put together, so it was all together. And he said, why don't you, you know, let's talk about, you know, getting this book published. And I said, what book? Number one, it's not a book. And number two, I don't have time to write a book. You know, I just don't have time. I don't have time, and I didn't. I have 5 kids. We have a very busy life. You know, we have a cabin in Minnesota. I was working full time. No, there's no way. I said, no, Barry, I'm not doing this. I'm not writing a book. There's no book. Forget about a book, you know. No. And guess what? That was year 1, and year 2 came back. Let's go out for coffee. How's the book coming? And, you know, I continued to do all this research and et cetera, and you know how that goes. Well, guess we got to year 6 or 7. He was persistent. And finally, this is interesting. So I collected so much information around the Jorden life, so that I started, you know, I was pretty smart about James Jorden. I was the only person really that knew about James Jorden. And when people would start talking about James, because now the Jorden House was, you know, up and running, and it was in the early 2000s, you know, and on. And people would start saying incorrect things about James Jorden, and that was irritating me to no end. It was bugging me. And then I would say to myself, well, Louise, how would they know? Because you're the only person that knows about James Jorden. And I said to myself, well, you know, that's their problem, not mine. And, you know, I can get over it. I don't have time to be writing a book or whatever. Anyways, but what happened was, this was the deciding factor, and it's in the foreword. I had collected so much information and had so many files that the West Des Moines Historical Society, and I actually had housed them over at the Jorden house, but the roof kept leaking. And then I pull it all out and bring it home. And then they patch it, and then I think, I don't want all this stuff in my house. And then the roof would leak again, and then I did that like 3 times. And finally I said, I'm keeping it. I'm not gonna do this anymore. I'm keeping it at my house, but where am I gonna put it? So I had this very expensive, gigantic bookcase built to house all of the information and, files and so forth. And that sat there for, several years, like 4 or 5 years, long time. And my husband finally said to me, Louise, why do we have, my husband now, who I was divorced and remarried, why do we have all this stuff? I know this guy's been asking you to write a book. He said, this is the deal. You either write the book or get rid of this stuff. Oh, he did, he said that. So I thought, you know what? And I was, probably the day before I'd been irritated by false information being, given about Jorden. And I think I was mad enough and whatever. And I said to my husband, if I do this, it's gonna take a long time, a lot of time, and I'm not gonna be available. By now our kids are gone and everything, so I actually had sort of time, but we have a busy life. And I said, it's gonna be, I don't even know if you know how bad it's gonna be in your life. You're gonna be abandoned because I'm gonna focus on this. And that's what I found out, because I'm no book writer, author. That's what writers do, is they just get, they literally live in their project. And that's what I did for the next 18 months. 18. Now that's a lot of time for my husband to literally be abandoned by me. But I would take it with me on vacations and I'd write, like we'd go, I'll just use an example, the Palm Desert. He'd go to the pool and I'd be up writing. I'd be up writing for hours. And that's why the second person on this book, Jan, is here, because what we would do is we had a collaboration. Thank goodness for the internet. I'd do have my research all, and it's all in the computer, and I'm no computer expert, so that was a learning curve too. But I'd have it all going on. I'd have, just for research, I'd have my phone going, my iPad going, and then I'd be typing, and I'd also be using Safari on my computer, and I had a lot of background information that I'd already known about. So, putting it, writing a chapter, sending it off to her, rewriting a chapter, writing the next chapter. And we did this, and I literally put in probably, well, I'd either be up until 3 in the morning, or I would write I'd get up at 3 in the morning, and I just write all day long, every day, terrible. But we got it done, so that is a good thing. But when it was time to publish it, it was like, now what do we do? I never published a book before. So, what happened was I put a team together. The best thing, what you do if you don't have a good enough brain on your, get your friends going. And I was wondering, who do I give this book to? Because I certainly was not going to be an author making money off of this book. This was I always gave my writing away when it was about James Jorden. James Jorden was the kind of guy that would be what he would have done. And I just felt like this was for my town, because by then I'd adopted pretty much Valley Junction. I'm not going to say all of West Des Moines, it's a little, big. But I had adopted Valley Junction as my hometown. And I actually live on Jorden Creek. My house, my condo, I have a townhome, it looks right down onto. And we're at the source, so we're way on the west side of the Polk County line. So we live just off of 60th Street. And so the wetlands that start Jorden Creek literally are a block from my house. So, and then it begins kind of where I live. And my townhome complex is Jorden Creek North. So the bottom line is, I put a team together, but I had to decide, what am I going to do with this book? And at the time, I was working. One of the things you need to also know is that I was on the board. Those of you who are on the board here, I was on the West Des Moines Historical Society board for 25 years, from the early 80s on. And then now I'm an advisor. I'm on like the advisory committee or advisory board. But my first loyalty was to, of course, the West Des Moines Historical Society, but I didn't think that they had the scope and the business situation at that time. Now they do. They're great. Scott Hatfield is the president. He's doing a great job. Things are just doing really well there. But at the time they were limping along a little bit. And Jim Miller was in charge of West Des Moines 125. He was the chair of the committee, and I talked to him, and Jim Miller actually, it was at that time, he's been replaced, he's moved on, but he's was in charge, the executive director of the Historic Valley Junction Foundation. And James Jorden started Valley Junction, so, you know, that would be a natural. And Jim said, you know, Louise, we would like to make this book a centerpiece of the celebration of the 125th. And he said, what we'll do is we'll get the city behind it, blah, 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 blah. And so, in here, you'll see, you know, who the sponsors of the book are. They are the 125th, the Valley Junction, my husband's law firm, and the city of West Des Moines. My husband's law firm didn't do that much, but I just felt like Gary had sacrificed enough. So we let them be part of it and give a little, you know, a little help too. So Jim Miller, who was the executive director of the Historic Valley Junction Foundation, was one of the people that I recruited, and my husband put together the contract where I signed everything over to them. So they did the whole business end of it. Michael Swanger, who is the editor and publisher of the Iowa History Journal, he was also a part of this, and he, of course, was very, very good about making sure that the book was promoted in the statewide and locally. But also, he, because of his experience in layout with magazines and so forth, he did a great job putting, helping us to format it, because you have only so many pages, and you want to, you know, you don't want to pay for too many pages, and you know, whatever. So that's what he helped us do, and it turned out well. And Donnie really was impressed with his, you know, suggestions, the publisher. I also got a retired photographer, 30 years at Meredith. There are over 150 photographs in here, and for free. This guy, who was, he was like the food photographer for a million years, so he knows how to do, and other things as well, but he photoshopped every single photo in here, and the photos are the best that they can be under the circumstances, and they're really good. And the maps, hard to reproduce, he did it. His name was Scott Little, and he did that. We also had Barry here from the publisher, Jan, of course, my editor, and then we decided that, you know, we're all pretty old, so we needed a millennial. So Katie Genny, who was an intern at the West Des Moines Historical Society, and she was one person who helped me organize my materials. She was the one that helped with all the photographs, making sure they were in the right chapters, getting what's the captions underneath, and she'd say, Louise, don't get too wordy here, and then type them in, you know, and all that, and making sure that everything was, you know, all sent off just the way it needed to be, in computerized form. Don't even ask me about it, because only she could explain it, and she'd have these conversations with them. So you always need a millennial. You need a millennial because they know how to do the computer. I mean, that's the bottom line. So that's how the book came together. And then it came out during the 125th, and we wanted it to be a local venture. So it's for sale through, and I'm just telling you this, and then we'll get into James Jorden a little bit. It's for sale through Beaverdale Books, which is local, the West Des Moines Historical Society, local, and the Valley Junction Foundation. And when I sell, you know, whatever, when I do book talks. All the money goes to the community. And so what happened is that with these kinds of projects, and I'm going to tell you, there's one right now that Donning is doing that I'm familiar with, because I have a cabin in northern Minnesota. They're doing one on the Iron Range up in the, you know, up in that area north of Duluth. It's a $750,000 project that the Iron Range Resource and Rehabilitation Board or whatever is, they have given the money to write this extremely thick book. And there's only gonna be so many, printed, not very many, like under 100, maybe 75, because they're so thick in there. There's one that has a, panoramic page in it that, is like, I can't tell you how many, plates, folds are in it. But typically what Donnie will do is they'll get the financing, and then they'll do the book, and then the organization sells and gets the money, because it's all a public service kind of thing. So that's what we did with this. All the money goes back to the Valley Junction Foundation, and then they pass it out to whoever. I know that, initially they did all of the flowers, in the planters all up and down Fifth Street. And if you see them, they're gorgeous. But every year, that changes, and the money goes where they decide. So, now you know how the book was done. A lot of people are very interested in it, and there's always a million questions around that, so hopefully I have now extinguished your curiosity, and we'll talk about James Jorden. So, I just want to tell you that the book is divided into 45 chapters, 6 sections. And the divisions actually came after we wrote it. So we wrote all of these different pieces of it, and then we kind of organized around it. What was very interesting is that that Jan, my editor, when I first asked her if she would be interested in helping me, she said, she read what I'd written, and she said, this is really interesting and really good, and of course we've got to work on, a lot of things about it, but she said, what about James Jorden before he came to Iowa? Because I'd only written about James Jorden when he was in Iowa. I never wrote about why did he come to Iowa? What about his family? Where did they come from and all of that? And so that was 6 months worth of extremely diligent research on my part to find out, well, where did the James Jorden and the Cunninghams, and by the way, the Cunninghams were Scots-Irish, and this is their plaid, that's why we have that plaid on there. His name is James Cunningham Jorden. And I said, on one side, the Jorden side was German, which we thought they were Dutch, but we found out they were German. And the other side, the Cunninghams were Scots-Irish, Protestant, moved from around Glasgow, Scotland, the family in the early 1600s, to the Ulster plantation, which was a Protestant plantation from a Protestant settlement that King James IV, I believe it was, wanted to push the Catholics out. So it brought these Scots people in, Presbyterians mostly, in to settle around Belfast. And then for 100 years they fought, or more. Even now they're fighting, but the Cunninghams said we're out of here. In about 1730 to 1750, they left, and they, like so many others did, they left Ireland, and they went to, they came into the United States, or actually at that point it wasn't the United States in the 1750s. We hadn't had the Revolutionary War yet, but they came into North America by way of Philadelphia, and then through Pennsylvania, and then Virginia was one state at the time of Virginia and West Virginia, but it was bisected by the mountains that are the Shenandoah Mountains and all of those mountains. So we had Tidewater and Piedmont, which is the hilly part of Virginia, and then you have the mountains, and then you have a mountainous West Virginia. You understand how that works.
Right.
Nobody had even been over the mountain, like the bear goes over the mountain to see what he could see. Nobody went to see what they could see until the 1730s, from Virginia over. Nobody, because those mountains were so hard to cross. And when they finally did, and they needed to expand into the mountains, but you couldn't get there. You couldn't get over the mountains from, at that point, Virginia. So they all came in the back way through Pennsylvania and down into down the river valleys. Yeah, and so they did. So what the Cunninghams did, like so many others, they went from Philadelphia to maybe 2 or 3 years in Pennsylvania, just trying to figure it out. And then they heard that there's good, supposedly good land in West Virginia. Have you ever heard about any good land in West Virginia? Well, at the time there was, because there were still river bottoms, so they could settle there. So the Cunninghams actually did settle in really, really good land on the south branch of the Potomac River, and, which flows then into, by Washington DC. It's not even that far. And so they were able to establish a very nice farm in those bottomlands. And there is a place in Western Virginia called Cunningham, West Virginia, after James Cunningham's family, which I think is very cool. But just like, but in Virginia, slavery was legal. So they had slaves, which is interesting since James was such an abolitionist. Well, that was the Cunningham side. The other side was the Jorden side, and they were poor indentured servants that came in as, or one ancestor, his like great-great-grandfather came in as an indentured servant. They called him, I just lost the word. I'll think of it. Anyways, there's a word, but it's basically indentured servant, and he came in again through Philadelphia, and was bought, literally purchased for 7 years of servitude. Oh, it's redemptionist is the word. He redeemed his ships. It was free for him to come on the ship from Holland, which is why we thought he was Dutch, to America. But he had, in order to pay for his fare, whoever met him and bought his ticket for him in Philadelphia at the other end got to take him home with them, like a slave almost. And then he agreed to work for 7 years. So, and he was poor, so he came with no money. The Cunninghams came with some money from Ireland. They were fairly well off. But they also got this good deal. They came a little earlier than the Jorden side. And anyway, so the Jordans were always up in the hills, in the bad farms, and up in the hills is where the escaping slaves from Virginia and the Carolinas, they were busy making their way through the mountains into Ohio and over into the Great Lakes area and up to Canada. So the Jordans saw firsthand these slaves that were sneaking through and helping them, because the Jordans were Protestants, and they ended up all becoming, when the Jordans and the Cunninghams finally, 2 or 3 generations, one of the Cunningham daughters married one of the Jorden kids, they ended up becoming very devout Methodists. And in the 1830s, the Methodist Church split, and that's after the Revolutionary War, after the War of 1812, into Southern Methodist and Northern Methodist, and over the issue of slavery. Just like the state of Virginia split during the Civil War over the issue of slavery. So many things split. I think the Baptist Church split as well. So again, how do history and religion intersect? All right, so this is all, they came in all before the Revolutionary War. They, the Cunninghams came from Ulster, the Ulster plantation. The Jordans came from Palatinate, Germany, the Basel, Strasbourg, along the Rhine River through, it comes out in Holland, and they came to, they eventually came into Western Virginia, and a few generations, the 2 families joined with this one couple, which are James Jordan's grandparents, and then his parents too. These are things that I learned. The Indians were friendly at first, and I read books and books and books about history of Virginia to find out more information about the Cunninghams. Let me just tell you that there were many Cunningham families, but not just James's ancestors. There were like between 8 and 11 different Cunninghams. So just figuring out which Cunningham family it was really hard. It took me months, literally months, to figure this out. I could not. I just had to read so much stuff. But in the books that I read, and they had a lot of historians write about the history of the various Virginia counties, 100 years later. So they might have known things firsthand, but typically it was more what they heard of, but it was alive in their heads. And one of every single book that talked about the beginnings of settlement in Western Virginia talked about how bad it was with the Indians, and it was a bloodbath, a bloodbath. At first, the Indians were very friendly, like they always are, you know. What's the problem? And then as the white settlers came in, it was just awful because the Indians realized that they were not going to, and I call them Indians in the book. We had a little struggle, Native Americans, Indians, but they were always referred to as that, so I stayed with Indians. They started to push back, push back, push back. And George Washington actually was a surveyor at the time. We all know he was a surveyor. But, you know, surveyors were, it was smart to be a surveyor because what happens? You go out into nowhere, the wilderness, you figure out what's going on out there. You realize what's really good land and what's really, you know, not so good. And then what do? You buy the good land, you know? And George Washington was, you know, right in that mix, which is interesting. I don't know if you know, ever thought about it, but I love George Washington, but, you know, he was a pretty good businessman. And anyway, so he also then was part of the militia and the military, and he was in charge, as a colonel, of building a lot of forts along a line to protect the pioneer settlers of Western Virginia and keep the Indians somewhere else so that they wouldn't come in and kill off the settlers. It was awful. Scalping, I've got it in the book. It's awful. It was kind of interesting too, though. You know? Then in the 1750s they had the French and Indian War, and one of Jordan's ancestors, and the Cunningham side, they were his like great grandfather was married, but his wife had passed, so he married another gal. She was pregnant. They killed him, scalped him. They kidnapped her and took her to Ohio along with her, like, pretty young son, like, and her own son, which is James Jordan's direct ancestor. And they let her go. She had the baby in the Indian camp, and they let her go back to her plantation in Western Virginia. I mean, and plantations then weren't like what we're thinking about now, and they never were in Western Virginia for the most part. They were much more hardscrabble and smaller, and not so many slaves. But anyways, but this James Cunningham, they kept him for a long time, and tortured him and starved him, and he came back half blind. He also came back with a wife, which is interesting, not an Indian wife. Somehow or another he met. He came back by way of Pennsylvania. Maybe somebody took him in, but at any rate, they came back to the plantation too. But he was he had so much post-traumatic stress that he couldn't stay in this supposedly civilized area where the family plantation / farm was. So he went into further Western Virginia, and he was up in the mountains, and that's kind of where, you know, what happened there. So it was very interesting that way. So James Jordan's grandfather fought in the Revolutionary War. His Jorden grandfather, the Cunninghams, fought in the Revolutionary War. And then on the Jorden side, I don't know, this was interesting too. Virginia, as a state, extended back in the early part of our American history all the way to the Mississippi River. Yeah, isn't that something? And so did all the other states. They all went over, you know. And then finally, as population increased, they kind of broke up into their own states and whatever. But after the Revolutionary War, because Mississippi was pretty much occupied by the French and all that, the American government wanted to have an American presence over by the Mississippi. So some of the generals from the Revolutionary War took different, some of the fighters of the, some of the soldiers, that had fought in the Revolution and started settlements along the Mississippi River. Isn't that interesting? I didn't know that. And so that was the case with James Jordan's side. He took his wife and one of his kids, and they went and settled by the Ocala River near Vandalia, Illinois. And then then people died and whatever, and they decided to come back to Virginia and et cetera. But that I thought was kind of interesting. The descendant from them there was the one that married into the Cunninghams. That couple had 11 children. James was born in 1813, right after the War of 1812. And they lived in the hills of western Virginia. And they lived near, if anybody's been to the Greenbrier, has anybody been to the Greenbrier in West Virginia? It's a real fancy resort. And they lived in, it's beautiful there. It's all hills and mountains and gorges and rivers and whatever. And that's where they lived, but up in the hills. And at that point, this was, as James got older, his family, again, became staunch Methodists, very much anti-slavery, saw these slaves escaping, tried to do what they could do, you know, of good conscience. But a big problem was, number one, the number of slaves to white people in the state of Virginia was 80 slaves to every 100 people, only 20 white people. The white people were getting very nervous because they were so outnumbered, and they knew that there was going to be, they all knew, there was just this foreboding sense that there was going to be problems. Then we had Bacon's Rebellion in 1676 and 1677. That was the first one. Was way before, or not way before, but was kind of around the time of the Revolutionary War. And that was when white people against the ruling elite in Eastern Virginia, the slaves fought against those people. That was in Eastern Virginia, in actually the Tidewater area where the big plantations were. But then, about 60 years later, in 1831, 56 slaves slaughtered 56 white people in Eastern Virginia, Nat Turner's Rebellion. That scared them to death, terrified them. And at that point in time, and the Western Virginians were trying hard to separate from Virginia because most of them did not like slavery. Their farms were too small to have slavery, and in the early 1830s, James Jordan's family, his father passed, they pulled up roots, and they said, we're out of here, we're gonna leave, we can't stand it anymore. This is getting too hot for us. It's everything that we're living in is against our principles, and we wanna be out of here. Plus, the soil was not great, the farms weren't great, and so it was time for them to go. So he and a number of his siblings and his mother, there were 3 or 4 older sisters who were married and were settled in Western Virginia. They stayed back, but the rest of them went to Pete Buttigieg country, down in southwestern, Michigan, Berrien County, and they, and it's the most southwestern county there. It's near, it's in that area. They homesteaded there for 6 years with a bunch of other people from the area. And that's where James Jorden got married. He and his brother married 2 sisters, good Methodists also. And the brothers were very close to the sisters, and they always kind of stuck together, John and James. And they had a plan that evolved to go to Oregon during that time, because now it's further into the 1830s. So they are hearing about, you know, the promised land in Oregon and the land of milk and honey. Some missionaries had kind of forged the first wagon trail over to the west. They were paying attention to this, and they said, well, gee, maybe we should, I don't think they ever thought that they were ever gonna stay in Michigan. And they just got this bug to, you know, keep going west. And so a few of the people, they knew that they were leaving, they were going west to Oregon and to Washington and whatever, and they were leaving from the St. Joseph Independence area of Missouri, and they said, well, let's send some of the siblings out there to see what's going on and see whether this is a feasible plan. And so they did. They sent a couple of the kids, you know, they're young adults now, they're all kind of getting married and whatever, they're all, you know, 20-somethings. They go there and they say, hey, this is not a bad idea, we could do this. We could go to Oregon, you know, but what we have to do is we have to all go. We have to leave Michigan, and we need to go over to the Kansas City area and get ourselves staged to leave, because this is a big trip. So they did, in dribs and drabs, over the next 3 or 4 years, they left. And they went to, they settled there, they started homesteading places there, and they entered into a large animal business, where they decided that they would buy and sell the animals that will pull their wagon. But they would buy them and sell them, and they'd just pick the best ones for themselves and sell the rest of them to others, and that's what they did. And what's very interesting is that one of the partners in this that was not in the family, his name is Calvin Smith. His father started Smithville, Missouri, and he was one of the first settlers in northwestern, or the area in northwestern Missouri, which is not really, it's more just, you know, western Missouri, near Kansas City. He was a very staunch abolitionist himself. His son, or his father started it, and Calvin himself married James Jordan's youngest sister, who at the time was like 18. They saw each other at the well, fell in love, you know, and all of that. So that was cool. And he was the one, he had the knowledge of a local area to you know, put this business together, and they were very successful. And that was the beginning of James Jorden. Now, when he was when the Cunningham family, well, let's start in Scotland. In Scotland, the name Cunningham, I think, means cow jumps over the stream or something, whatever. So when they got to Virginia, then they had a huge cattle and livestock operation. It's all about the animals. And I also want to tell you that this is such a total coincidence. Their next door neighbors, they had quite a, you know, thousands of acres in their own area, the Cunningham family did, on their plantation. The next door neighbors who had even, you know, 10,000 or 20,000 acres in the same river valley, guess what their name was? Van Meter. Now think about this. The Jorden house is where it's at. What's the next town after, you know? Van Meter. It's so bizarre. So that I thought, no, and everybody says, have you done research on that? No, I don't have time for that. But at any rate, they're in Kansas, the Kansas City, which at that point was called Westport area, and they're engaging in this very, very good business. And they're thinking about going to, you know, Oregon and getting all ready to do it. And then what do they hear? They hear that it's time for the Indians to leave Iowa. They get the news. And Fort Leavenworth is not far from Kansas City, or at that point Westport. And there were many forts in the frontier. And Leavenworth was one. And guess what another one was? On a much smaller scale. Fort Des Moines. And there was a path. And guess what it was called? The Dragoon Trail. And there were many. There's the Dragoon Trace, there's the Dragoon this, but what it was it was formerly an Indian path, you know, from one place to another, and then it became the way that you got from the Westport, Leavenworth area up to Fort Des Moines. Not that it was traveled that much at that point in time, but it was definitely a trail that was established. And so the Jorden boys decided, well, you know what? Let's go check this out. We've heard about what's this Iowa, and at the time, Iowa was being touted as another land of milk and honey. And literally, throughout the world, there were advertisements to come to Iowa. And at that time, Iowa was only this big. And this is the Mississippi River, so it was just here. There was all the rest of Iowa that was available eventually for settlement, because of course we know the Native Americans were not. Oh, I don't know if you got to see this over here. So it's little, you know, and Iowa City's in the middle. Okay, and so what happened was they got to the fort. Now they weren't supposed to even be in Iowa because it was Indian territory. They were not supposed to be there. The forts were there to keep white settlers out. This was not even part of the United States at that time. And so here comes James and John, real, nice guys, friendly, whatever. And what happened? They made friends with the people of the fort. The people of the fort liked them. They said, why are you here? Well, just like anybody else that had wandered up the trail, they said, we want to look it over. We think maybe we might want to settle here instead of going out to Oregon. They said, well, we don't do this for just anybody, but we like you. So if you're going to do a large cattle operation, go down the river, down where the Jorden house is. Lots of water, cattle need water. It's not too far away. It was really only about 4 miles from the fort as the crow flies. And in the winter, you can get there back and forth very easily because everything's frozen. And so they said, they looked it over and they actually blazed trees and they said, we think when the time comes, because we know it's coming, the treaties have been signed and it's just a matter of time, we want this area. And lots of gentlemen's agreements. You probably know enough about Des Moines history. Saylorville, John Saylor was a farmer for the fort. Thomas Mitchell worked they all had their, little plots figured out and, that was holy territory. So that was what happened. And so they eventually came to Des Moines and settled there when it was when the treaties were enforced. The natives were sent back down the Dragoon Trail to an area south and a little west of Fort Leavenworth. There's a section in the book, it's about 7 pages long. I just felt like I needed to do this. I have the whole story of the Indians, the Meskwaki Indians, that were here at that time. Their whole story from the time they were over on the East Coast, came through the Great Lakes area, went to Wisconsin, fought in many wars, were down by Rock Island and all of that, ended up in Iowa, and then, of course, sent down that Dragoon Trail to, and there were 2 tribes, the Sac and the Fox, but the U.S. government put them together as one tribe. They were really not one tribe, there were 2 tribes. One of the tribes was more agrarian than the other, and so the Fox Indians were really the ones. Now they called, and there were some Sac too. The Sac pretty much stayed more in after all of this. The Fox Indians, a lot of the Indians didn't leave. They just hid in the woods and didn't go down that trail to this reservation that they had on the other side of the Missouri River in not the United States, in non-United States land. Anyway, so that whole story is told how the Meskwakis came back or resurfaced, bought their land, they were not given the land in Tama, and how they established themselves, but it was not easy. One of the ways that they were able to do it was because the legislature, I believe the Iowa State Legislature in 1856, when James Grimes was governor, they were looking, they allowed people, and they didn't consider Indians humans. They had a shill in the Tama County area that actually bought the land for them, and somehow or another they ended up getting title to it through some legislative actions. James Jorden was one of the legislators that voted it in, and and one of the reasons why, and it's in the book too, is that when they first came up from Westport and settled on that and they were like in a little lean-to, and it was wintertime and the snow came, and some of the Indians that had not left, they knew what was going on over with this little white family, in this pathetic, situation, and there were a lot of kids, there were 5 or 6 kids at the time, and they came and they helped the Jordans survive the winter. They brought them food, they did, what they could do. Jorden never forgot it, and that was one of the reasons why he helped, he voted pro for the Indians, and that's what gave them a toehold in Iowa, which is now expanded to, the area that they've got. That's a little aside about the Indians, but I'm proud that part of the book is in the book. So Then they settled in Iowa. Now, I'm just gonna quickly, you kind of know a little bit about James Jorden already, but maybe some of the things that you don't know, is, that he became a state senator. He was in the Senate mostly during the first part of the 1850s. He took over, the seat of another guy who did not wanna continue on, a doctor. And, James Jorden was responsible for passing legislation that had been introduced prior to him coming into the Senate. And remember, the legislature met at that time still in Iowa City. Didn't move to Des Moines until the late 1850s. Anyways, James Jorden took up the torch and said, you know, this has been introduced. We need to put the capital of our state in the center of the rectangle, not over on one side of the rectangle of Iowa. And he said, my town is as good as any other one, and probably better. And the people down in Lee Township, down in that Rock Island, you know, Quad Cities area, they agreed. Because why? Because at the time, the only way to get to Des Moines were trails or the rivers. The rivers were the interstates. And so, James Jorden, you know, allied himself with those people at the mouth of the Des Moines River, and they really, and that's where a lot of population was, and they really supported this bill to make sure that that wherever the capital was on a path right down to their town, so that all of that commerce could go right down, and then of course all the counties along there too as well. So he was successful, and then the capital was moved in the late 1850s to Des Moines. James Jorden was the one that was responsible for getting that legislation passed. You may or may not know that. And see, all of these things were just kind of pushed aside when we were writing all these grants, because it was always Underground Railroad, Underground Railroad. And then finally, James Jorden kind of resurfaced as why is he important? Well, that's a huge thing. Other cities that were in contention were Ottumwa, Osceola, more in the south, but Des Moines got it. And interestingly, especially with the caucuses and whatever, the election, James Jordan's election initially as senator was so crooked. They were stealing votes and this and that and whatever, not he, but his opponent. And he almost was not elected, and it was of course over the issue of slavery, because the people from the legislature voted in the senators who would go to Washington, our state senators to go, or US senators to go to Washington. And there were a lot of people that wanted, we all know that James was an abolitionist, they wanted somebody who was pro-slavery to go, and so they rigged the election. They had to have a recount, does this sound familiar? Et cetera, et cetera. It was very, very interesting. So, and that's in there, and it's kind of fun. Okay, so one of the other things that I learned is when the capital did come to to Des Moines, why is it over on the east side of the river? Because the Democrats were on the west side of the river. They had these, you know, liberal press and all of this, blah, 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 and they kind of taken over where it was, and they were, you know, flourishing over there. James Grimes was the governor. He's a Republican. And it was a brand new party, and they were really powerful at that point in time. They had, you know, they had gotten lots of representation. Anyways, Grimes said, I don't want it over there where all those Democrats are. We're gonna put the capital on the east side. He made the decision. I did not know that. I think that's an interesting story. So that's in there too. James Jorden, he considered himself a citizen of Des Moines, which is of course why he wanted the capital to be in his town. He attended First Methodist Church in Des Moines. He got his mail in Des Moines. He went to Des Moines every day. He educated his older children in Des Moines. There were schools set up. Another thing that I've learned since the book, I mean, I knew this, and she's in it, is Anna Bird. The first, they call him president of the town council, was a Presbyterian minister called Thompson Bird, and he was like the first mayor. and he started Central Presbyterian Church, which is my church, by the way, I just want you to know. But at any rate, he started the church right in the very beginning. It wasn't the only church, but it was probably the most prominent church. And he was the mayor for a long time, and his wife was a teacher. And she set up a school in the old barracks of the fort, and a very good school. Now, her name was Anna Bird, and one of the very first public schools that was built in Des Moines was named after her. It's where Gateway Market is now. And this is what I learned, that you've heard of Birdland Park? Well, Thompson Bird was also a very good businessman. He bought up a ton of land in downtown Des Moines. At the time it was called Fort Des Moines. And he also bought that bottom land where Birdland Park is, and then he donated it, I believe, he donated it to the city. So that's interesting too, yes?
I think that Kiyosako Way is Bird's Run,
Yes, it was. You're
and
right.
it's covered over.
Yes,
All the water's going under there.
exactly,
great.
exactly. But there you go, you know? So that I thought was very interesting, and that is just like, I learned that, just like we just heard this gentleman say. Hey, I know about that, you know, that's why it's Birdland Park. I had no idea, I thought that was because there were a lot of birds in the park. I had no idea. You know, I mean, I'm from Wisconsin, what do you expect? So anyway, so what he did was, in Walnut Township, he was a school superintendent. He was in charge of the one-room schoolhouse, blah, blah, blah. He started several churches in his area in Walnut Township, which was the area of Polk County that is right down here. Here is Walnut Township, okay? And here's Des Moines. So you know that that's all northern Polk County, but this is where he was settled. And I mean, he literally was right. I mean, here's Commerce, so he's right like in here. So here, way down there. He must have like corners of states and counties. You know, this is Polk County, and he's down here. So he was in charge of the schools down in that area. He was in charge of all of the things that he needed to be in charge of, because he's one of the few settlers there, but there were other settlers. And his brother actually was over where, you know, where 56th Street kind of goes down to Walnut Creek. His brother settled in that area. It was called Heiner's Woods. And then he ended up leaving, and guess where he went? Oregon. So, also, James Jorden helped start the Republican Party. And he may have even met and known Abraham Lincoln, who was literally born within a year. They were born within a year of each other. So they were age mates. They had the same political, you know, ideas. And a thing that we may or may not know about Abraham Lincoln was he was, as many of the men were, or people were, women, men, whatever, at the time, very interested in the development of the railroad, because that would help commerce. And I mean, if it's between, as James Jorden did, sending all of his cattle down the Des Moines River on a flatboat to the Quad City area, and then from there down to St. Louis, or somehow getting them on a train and sending them to a market, you know, in the east, well, of course you want to do that. And Abraham Lincoln, truly, I mean, the money that helped get him elected came from the railroads, because he was pro-railroad, as was James Jorden. But also anti-slavery, and same with James. And another, something you may or may not know is that in Coralville, Iowa, Samuel Kirkwood was the mayor of Iowa City, and he ended up being a governor and all of that. But at any rate, and he was also part of the Underground Railroad, as was, in Grinnell. Josiah Grinnell was on the Underground Railroad, but they were all influential, names we all know. At any rate, the first Republican gathering of Republicans was not in Ripon, Wisconsin, which they say was the birthplace of the Republican Party. It really was in Coralville, Iowa, like a year or two earlier than that, which I think is extremely interesting. And it's also interesting to know that the Methodists that were living here were, for the most part, Republican. If you were Methodist, you were probably Republican. And if you were Republican, you were probably Methodist, which I thought that was interesting. Now, Josiah Grinnell was Congregational, and I'm not sure what Kirkwood was, but you know, interesting, I can't remember. I think he might have been Methodist, but, I mean, it's just such these links, you know. The other thing is, that he was, so involved in the Underground Railroad. And I was, you know, I was telling some of these gals that I was cleaning out my basement, and I discovered this map. So, I brought it today for the first time since I've given this talk. But, you can see that this is Des Moines, this is Nebraska City, this is Missouri. There was a huge enclave of, I'll do it this way, huge enclave of plantations along the Missouri River in Missouri. They called this area, and I learned this and it's in the book, Little Dixie. And they were worse to the slaves there than they were even in the Deep South. It was horrendous. And some of the books that have been written recently about slavery, and John Brown is part of it and whatever, and that they take place in this Missouri area. And John Brown, literally, he would get them, rescue them from their plantations, and they bring them over here. Now, this is the Missouri River. This is not the United States. This is, you know, not. This is the United States. Iowa was now in the Union. He'd get them out of the country, and then get them across the river. Tabor, here's Lewis and Atlantic, here's Bridgewater, Winterset, Earlham. Earlham was called, at the time, Bear Creek. That was a Quaker settlement. They'd come through here. A lot of times John Brown would escort them. I would imagine they also, you know, you never really know. It's just, you know, they're all dead, so they can't tell you. And it was a huge secret besides. So here is Des Moines. So they get here. They would decide if they were going to go. There's a place, I don't have it on here, but it's south of Des Moines by Carlisle, in that area, and I'll think of the name of it. Anyways, they had an option of going there, or coming to James Jordan's house, and then they crossed the river, and they would go to Mitchellville. There was a place across the river where the Grimes State Office building was, and there was a very active man on the Underground Railroad that would take them in there if they needed to. Mitchellville, Newton, there was a kind of a satellite place that was there, Grinnell, and then over to Iowa City. And Iowa City was where, and this is West Branch and Springdale, which is where John Brown had his arsenal. He also had an arsenal in Nebraska City, or in Tabor, I mean. But this is where he collected all of the guns and rifles and everything he needed to do Harper's Ferry. It was all, and interesting is, these are Quaker communities. So I thought that was kind of fun.
Did Palmyra fit into that?
Pardon me?
Did Palmyra fit into that?
Probably. You know, that's very familiar.
I wondered if that wasn't.
And Rising Sun is the town.
Yeah, by Carlisle.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And I, you know, when I made this a million years ago, I didn't know about that. And then I found out, so I need to add that, now that I rediscovered this map. But anyways, and then a lot of them would come up from this way and get to Iowa City. But then there was a train in Iowa City that could take them across to Chicago, up through the Great Lakes, and then to Freedom in Canada. So that, I think, is kind of interesting. And the Jorden house was on there, and very secret. If people found out that he was, what he was doing, and his wives were very much involved, particularly, he was married 2 times, first wife, Melinda, passed when she was 35, and then he remarried Cynthia, who was from the area. If you watch the movie Harriet Tubman, Harriet would bring slaves up to northern New York, this lakes area of New York, and over the border, and that's exactly where she was from. So she was really programmed to be a partner. And she came, Cynthia was a school teacher in Winterset, a widow, came with her father. Somehow she got to, maybe her husband passed, we're not sure. But I couldn't figure out what was going on there. But she was with her father and a widow. He needed a school teacher, and this is around in the mid-1850s. He had just finished his tenure as state senator, and actually he was he was too late to see his wife die, who had like pneumonia or whatever. He was in Iowa City and got there like a day too late, and she passed, probably of pneumonia, who knows. We don't know that either, but might have been childbirth, doubtful, but maybe. At any rate, so then he marries Cynthia, who's very committed to this, and they're continuing to help the slaves through in the late 1850s. Nobody talked in the whole family. The first time we see anything in writing about any family member, any of the children, and there were a lot of young kids there that were in the house living, was in 1875 when there were some things written, but that was it, nothing. They just kept it a secret because it was so bad. The slave catchers could come and burn down their house and do this and do that. Oh, they could just ruin them. So it was very quiet. James Jorden was good friends with John Brown, who was a crazy man. John Brown gave him a rifle, which is in the Jorden house. John Brown, when he would bring slaves through, he usually had them underneath the hay in a hay wagon. And then John Brown would never, people say, well, where were the slaves? You know, did they offer them a B&B service at the Jorden house? No, they were probably hidden in the creek bed, which is like a big gully. If it was in the summertime, there might have been little caves in there. Out in the barn, maybe, if it was particularly, clear. Out in the field somewhere, there might have been a place, maybe down by the river or whatever. They hid them around. They did not have them in the house. They did not, unless maybe they were really sick, but it's very unlikely that they were ever, if they were, there would have been a secret compartment. We haven't seen any or anything like that, but they talked about tunnels that went out of the Jorden house that maybe went to the barn or whatever, and we never could find any, but we did, it's possible because there were tunnels in Tabor. Because our Iowa dirt had so many roots that go down like 1.5 to 2 feet that you could dig under those and actually make a tunnel and it would stay. So, that was always the gossip or the story, but we could never prove anything. And that was during the time I was on the board for 25 years. So we looked for a long time. A long time. One interesting story was John Brown had a bunch of slaves with him, and they were making their way across, and they got to Dallas Center. Of course, they didn't know it was Dallas Center, but it was that area. And James Jordan's oldest son, Benjamin, was and James Jorden had like 2,000 head of cattle. Think about it. Think about how you would get those to market. He ranged them all the way as far west as Atlantic, Iowa, before there were fences. And he had cowboys, and Benjamin, his oldest son, was a cowboy, and he was out there with the cows, and here comes John Brown with these slaves, and he's lost. He doesn't know where to go. And Benjamin points him in the direction of the Jorden house. But he was out by Dallas Center. I think that's kind of interesting. And again, when I tell you about the cows and the pigs, 2,000 hogs, 2,000 pigs, he was a huge agribusinessman. We call it that now. That's amazing. And how did he get his cattle and hog to market? Flatboats down the Des Moines River. How did the dragoons get to, in 1830s, to Fort Des Moines? A steamboat up the Des Moines River, where their horses were on there and everything. The river was everything back then. And then those were the routes too that ended up becoming where the trains all were built as well, because that land was all designated by the U.S. government as U.S. land, and then they sold the land to the railroad companies, and that's why we have the railroads where we have them. The other thing that he did, he was a captain of industry, but the industry is not like a factory. We have our big industry here in Des Moines is insurance. And when F.M. Hubbell came to town after the Civil War and started to, really talk a lot about how we need insurance, because how many widows were there from the Civil War? So that was a concept that was accepted and, you know, enthusiastically accepted. He needed people to be on his first board of directors to make him legit, because he wasn't really, you know, he was not one of the originals. He came later. So we made friends fast, because he had every influential person in Des Moines on that board, you know, all the names, Hoyt Sherman, I can go on, there's like 15 names of people that you see streets named after in Des Moines. And they're all on there, and they're all indicating that this is a legitimate operation, and James Jorden, of course, was one of them. So they got the original insurance company started, and then there were more and more that sprang up. Then another interesting fact is that James Jordan's oldest daughter, he had 11 children, his oldest daughter, his name was Emily, and she fell in love with and married a Civil War surgeon from Ohio, who had come to work for the railroads when they finally got here after the Civil War. He was a railroads doctor, cared for all the workers on the railroad, and there were probably lots of injuries from the railroad. This is the beginning, and building the railroads and maintaining the railroads, but also anybody that, you know, was on the train that needed some medical attention. But he was put here in Iowa, or came to Iowa for that. His name was George Hannawalt. Have you heard of Hannawalt? Hannawalt School? Okay, so Emily and George got married. They never had children, but what they did do is they devoted their life to, and probably a lot of James Jordan's money, to starting all the hospitals in Des Moines. There were no hospitals, even after there were some, you know, startup hospitals that would, you know, because of a flu epidemic or this or that, but there were never any permanent hospitals. And George Hannawalt started Cottage Hospital, which ended up being a little part of Methodist Hospital, and then it probably went away. But then, and also Tracy Helm, which was more of a long-term health care facility. But they started the hospitals, and that was a big deal, as you well know. And all of the hospitals that have risen from, you know, risen in our town is because of George Hannawalt. That's why they named a school after him. Did I know that? No. But I learned. And then, so let's talk quickly, and I'm almost done, about James and all these cows and pigs that he's raising. What are we going to do with them? You know, what are we going to do with them? You know, this is getting old. All these, you know, we're done. We're over it. We're over the transportation issue. And what he did was, because the railroad did come to Des Moines, and there was a big fight over who, just like with the Capitol, Osceola wanted it, or Toma wanted it to come from Eddyville. It stopped at Eddyville at the beginning of the Civil War. It took forever just to get it over the Mississippi River down in the Rock Island area. They finally got it over the Mississippi River, and then they got tracks built to Eddyville, and then the Civil War started. So no money, no nothing. But in 1866, they finally completed tracks. But the fight to get it to whose town first, well, 70 businessmen in Des Moines, James Jorden was one of the premier, he was one of the ringleaders, said if we can bribe the railroad and give them enough money, and that's just how business was done, then we will, you know, we'll get it, because they'll come if we give them enough money. And so they raised like $100,000. They raised a ton of money to bribe the railroad to build the tracks to Des Moines, and so they were. And so, thank goodness, you know. So now we've got railroad service to Des Moines, and then it continues into western Iowa. And James Jorden says, oh, and the railroad, one of the railroad companies says, we want to build tracks to Waukee. Now this is kind of where Urbandale and Clive come in, because I think that track was going to go through Clive originally, and James said, wait a minute. I want you, don't build your track from Des Moines to Waukee through Clive. Build it through my area, because I need a spur to get these cattle that would come racing down 8th Street not Fifth Street, Eighth Street, down to that area, kind of where Reiner's is now, or was, you know, the big roundhouse. That was where his cattle pens were, and his house was not much further down the way. He wanted, and that was bottomland, so, and there's probably water there and et cetera for the cattle. So the cowboys would herd him down in a CMP down 8th Street, what is now 8th Street, down to the yards, and the railroad said, I mean, this is after the railroad was built, but the railroad said, yeah, we'll build you a line, and then it'll go up too. And that's the line that goes by my house, by Jorden Creek. And it'll go end up in Waukee. But they said, you're gonna need to build some houses for the railroad track workers. So they did, right there in that 8th Street area. And then the cattle yards were there and all that. And so that was a good thing for James Jorden. And that was in the early 1870s. And then more and more people came to Valley Junction, it wasn't even called Valley Junction, more and more people came to this area, settled. And so I have some maps about Valley Junction, and it's here. So here we are. This is our little Valley Junction. Here's Des Moines, and it finally evolved into a real town, which was a crazy town because it was like a Wild West town. There were houses of prostitution. There were bars. It was so bad that the police went around there were bowling alleys. It was really bad. They'd go around and they would collect money from all of the bad places that created all this havoc, and to finance the jail operation because there were people in jail all the time. So that was a colorful moment, and that continued for a long time in Valley Junction. And then on the other side of the track, eventually, on the other side of the track, where the pens used to be and all of that, they were after the 1880s, and barbed wire came in and all that. Jorden couldn't pasture his livestock out in western Iowa, and so he just went into breeding stock, as did F.M. Hubble, as did Flynn from the Flynn Mansion. They all went into this gentleman's hobby of breeding excellent stock. And so he also did that. So he didn't have these masses of livestock to transport to Chicago now, not down, originally it was down to St. Louis. Now the trains are taking this livestock to Chicago. Anyway, so this town, 5th Street then, evolved, a commercial area. And this is the deal. James Jorden, I'm gonna get back to the Methodist thing. He tried to start several churches. He went to First Methodist in Des Moines. Then he tried to start several churches out in his neighborhood. The people who were living out in that area, they would gather for church services in his home, which was a big house considering. And they had church services there when an itinerant preacher would come through. But he wanted it to be more permanent. So he tried to build these churches and they kept failing. Well, finally they got a church started where Old Clegg Park School is on 8th Street. And they decided, that it wasn't grand enough. So they decided they wanted to build a bigger and better church. And they were smart enough to put one of James Jorden's sons on the board of that church and the building effort. And they built a church that did not have a name, but it was a Methodist church where Marimoto School is. Okay? And they built it, and it was beautiful, and except for that, they ran out of money towards the end. And so guess what? Guess who gave the money to finish the church? James Jorden. Guess what they named it? Jorden Methodist Church. And it was being dedicated a few days before his birthday. And I can't remember how old he was, but he was, like almost 80th birthday, I think it was. And, you write the book, you know everything, and then you forget. But, anyway, yeah.
Where was that church at?
It was at Merrill Middle School, up on Grand Avenue.
Okay.
And that was kind of a no man's land between Des Moines and Valley Junction, which was always kind of considered Valley Junction. And in fact, there was a school that was built right next to it called Jorden School. And he'd also already built Jorden School down by his house. So here's another school they call Jorden School, and it's part of the West Des Moines school system. You know, the Valley Junction school system, which is very interesting. So this is all, and his brother had a farm just to the south of there along Walnut Creek. So this was kind of a, you know, that Frisbee Park area, 56th Street, Walnut Creek. That was all sort of, Des Moines maybe, Valley Junction maybe, whatever. Anyway, so the church was being dedicated. Now, I told you about how rowdy Valley Junction was. It was terrible. James Jorden, when he was a state senator, successfully got the prohibition laws passed, which continued until the 1890s. So that was like 50 years of prohibition in Iowa. He was so proud, and all of his Methodist buddies that were also Republicans were also very proud. And that's kind of has informed a lot of our social life, even to this day, kind of, you know. Anyway, so he's a prohibitionist, and he realizes he has started a town that's out of control. Valley Junction, it is out of control. And he is so upset. And his heart is failing, and he's in poor health, and you know, all of this other stuff. And he says, so he's in church where this church is being dedicated, and the minister is saying that this church is a house of God. This church is to, you know, worship, you know, and whatever. And James Jorden, who's sitting in the front row, stands up in poor health, and he says, and it's not a saloon. Okay? And guess what he did? He had a heart attack and fell over and died. In church. In church. So he was happy to die, probably in a Methodist church. But it did kill him. And I think that that's kind of an interesting story. And with that, I will be done. I know that this was a long talk, but hopefully you've learned something about my topic.